Chapter 1. Morocco. Every country in the world? How many is that? Depends how you count. The UN recognizes 190-something, but there's another 10 or so pseudo-states. Taiwan, Northern Cyprus, Transnistria, places like that.
Transnistria?
I have no idea where or what that is. The Dutchman grabbed his pack of cigarettes off the table. Do you mind? Go for it, said Joshua, though of course he minded. The Dutchman was the only company he'd had in a couple days. He hadn't seen any other Westerners in Agadir, so he wasn't about to be difficult. Everyone else smokes like a chimney in this country, he told himself. What's a little more gonna do? Josh had hopped a bus west to Windy Aswara, with its fortress walls, then followed the coast down to Agadir, passing by groves and groves of trees, their branches crowded with goats. Yes, goats. Consulting his guidebook, he'd learned that they ate the tree nuts and crapped them out half digested, and then the result was made into some sort of overpriced cosmetic oil. Somehow he found that immensely disappointing. The trees, the climbing goats, the goat herds waiting in the shade. It had made a sort of mystic tableau, queerly beautiful to him in its inscrutability. All for something so pedestrian, Joshua had thought. Is that the right word? The Dutchman lit up, spoiling the taste of the ocean air. Joshua had always loved the sea. He found it calming to gaze out into the horizon. Plus, a beach town was a place to catch some rays and maybe clear up his pea spots. The ones on his arms were pink today. Not bad. Must be relaxed. His scalp didn't itch too much either. It must be the sweat moisturizing it, Josh thought. He'd actually read that the goat nut oil was supposed to help, but it was far too expensive for him. It turned out that Agadir wasn't a destination for Westerners. Saudis instead were strewn about the seaside, most of them fully clothed. Some men were bold enough to strip down to their shorts, revealing hairy chests and equally hairy backs. A few women swam in tracksuits, heads covered by hijabs. It looked incredibly impractical, like swimming with weights on. 2 or 3 women even took dips cloaked in black abayas, their faces hidden by niqabs. White salt stains rippled on the dark garments as they rose from the water. Joshua had tried laying out for a bit earlier, but he'd felt uncomfortably conspicuous among the piously enrobed, so he'd cut the tanning session short. Besides, Agadir was windy. Nowhere near as bad as Aswara, but he'd still been dusted with sand by every gust. In the end, he'd opted to spend the rest of the day walking the city.
Transnistria broke away from Moldova in the 90s,
he told the Dutchman. They actually have their own money, their own president, their own army. You even have to go through a border crossing when you enter. I hear the guards look like models. Moldova? Joris. His name is Joris, Joshua remembered. He was horrible with names. That's right. It sounds like your ass. That wasn't really a fair mnemonic device. Joshua thought Joris was a perfectly fine human being. His name just didn't work well in English. Moldova, Josh repeated. You know, in Eastern Europe. Was part of the Soviet Union? Oh, Moldavia. Of course. Yes, I know it. So, tell me,
what's in this Transnistria to see?
Not much, I suppose. It's still communist, so I think there's a bunch of statues of Lenin. Maybe some old tanks, ugly Soviet buildings, things like that. But you want to visit there? Joshua grinned. Well, yeah, that's the goal. To see every country before I die. And to have adventures. The Dutchman took another drag off his cigarette, then set his lighter down on the pack in the middle of the table. As he leaned forward, he nodded his head fractionally towards something behind Joshua. Joshua turned and saw a woman. A stunning woman, in fact, around his age. She glided along the boardwalk in a white abaya, embroidered with gold thread along the collar and sleeves. Jewels seemed to sparkle on her slim body as if she were a starry night. Thin fabric trailed behind her in the wind, like the proud banner of a lost sultanate. Her eyes, rich with mascara, were fixed on the ground she floated above. But then, for a brief moment, a very brief moment, those eyes flickered up to Joshua's. Her gaze was piercing. And Joshua found himself someplace else. He was riding a steed across endless, endless dunes of gold, baking beneath a white sun. An oasis appeared in the distance, complete with palm trees, impossibly green and impossibly lush against the barren sands. Then, the palace was there, with a dozen bulbed domes and countless Arabian arches ornately carved. Beneath a fig tree she stood, Fatima, waiting for him.
Fatima.
Yes, that must be her name. For a moment, Joshua thought of the Indian. He blinked long and hard to push the thought away, and turned back to the Dutchman in front of him. So what exactly defines a country? Joris was asking. Joshua had had this conversation before, but he didn't mind repeating it, especially with a European. They seemed to understand the quest better. Americans would ask why and furrow their brows. Joshua supposed they thought the world was as dangerous as their cable news claimed it was. Or perhaps it had just never occurred to them to see the world. Or perhaps they took the question as a challenge to their own life goals, or as a challenge to their lack of them. Europeans were different. They always acted like Josh's desire to see every country in the world was quite normal and logical, the sort of thing a person ought to be doing. They were amused, even encouraged by it. But Americans and Europeans and everyone else, wherever they were from, were always curious about what made a nation a nation. That's a tough one, Joshua began. One could say the UN, but given Taiwan and the West Bank, I could never use their definition on moral grounds. The Catalans and Basques of Spain would say that countries are defined by language and culture, but as an American, I find that idea a bit ridiculous. You can't use currency because some countries share money and don't have their own. Honestly, the best definition may be that it has its own standing army. Joris raised an eyebrow. So every resistance group is a country. No definition is perfect, Josh conceded. In the end, I'm essentially using the UN list, plus a bunch of others. Transnistria, Taiwan, Northern Cyprus. He counted on his fingers. Palestine, Western Sahara, Somaliland, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh. You made those last few up, didn't you? Joris chuckled. Those are just random sounds. The waiter came around for their orders. Joris asked for a coffee, Josh a kiwi lime juice. The cafe had no beer and no argila even, but it was outside offering a cool breeze. It made a good spot to sit and watch the tourists as they strolled by on the boardwalk. Arabs loved to people watch as well as Josh did, so the cafe was packed with Saudis, enjoying fruity drinks and spying on each other. So why are you here? Joshua asked. I'm trying to make a decision on something in my life, Joris replied, rather formally. A statement of maximum ambiguity, Joshua mused. New job? New kid, the Dutchman corrected. Maybe. I have to decide if I want to be a father. You're thinking about having a baby. My girlfriend is. Well, she's my sort of girlfriend. She's the one who wants the kid, so I have to decide whether I want to be part of that. I need some time by myself, away from my life in Rotterdam, to put it all in perspective. How old is she? 40. Ah, bioclock. She has to have one now before she can't? Well, she actually has one already, from before she met me, but that's fine. She wants another one, and I have to decide if I want to take on the burden. My job pays enough for me to live on, but I'm not sure about a family. Do you want children? No, not really. Well, do you want to be with her? We've been together for 5 years, but we have our problems. We're not exactly yin and yang. We've broken up a few times. She's kind of crazy and can't really hold down a job. She's bipolar. I see, Joshua said, though he didn't really. His parents, with all of their faults, got along swimmingly and had both wanted children. And all of those TV shows and movies had always told him that you wait until you find the one. That one incredible person who will bowl you over, and they'll just be perfect for you and you'll just know it's right. How could there ever be such a big disagreement between people who are meant for each other? And if you're with the one, why wouldn't you want to combine yourselves to form a child, something new and full of hope? But Joshua knew those feelings were naive. Joris sure wasn't talking like he'd found the one. But what did that mean anyway? Why would the universe, in all its complexity, concern itself with Joris's love affairs? It was ridiculous to imagine some higher power or Fate itself worrying over romance, in between doling out cases of bone cancer to children. Even the major religions, for all their idiocy, didn't make their gods custodians of the human heart. These were our mistakes to make. Joshua decided he very much liked Joris. The Dutchman was real and honest. He'd never had anyone paint his life to him so modestly, flaws and all. Most people looked you in the face and told you their lives were great. Life had given Joris lemons, and he was calling them lemons. The drinks had arrived. Joshua took a deep swig of his kiwi lime. The Arabs know how to make juice, I'll give them that. Or are they Berbers here? Joris finally put out his cigarette and sipped his coffee. Have you decided yet? Josh asked. No, Joris shrugged. Not yet. I don't know. It's not a dream situation. He looked out on the boardwalk, thoughtful. Though either way, I'm better off than these poor people. Arranged marriages with cousins, living life under a sheet. Joris suddenly looked quite sad. Well, dreams are paradoxes anyway. The Dutchman snapped out of it. How's that? Well, we know dreams are memories, things in the past, jumbled up. But we talk about them like they're the future. A dream girl, a dream job, things we hope we'll have tomorrow. Some people even think they're actual visions of what's to come. Foregone conclusions. Memory becomes prophecy, past becomes future. The more you think about the whole thing, the less sense it makes. Shit, Shakespeare wrote a whole play on it. Othello. Josh leaned back in his chair, grabbing the table to keep his balance. But omens aside, say our dreams did come true. That we got exactly what we wanted. What would that say? Just that our future is small and expected, easy to predict. That we're going nowhere new. A dream is supposed to be a liberating idea, not proof that we're stuck where we are, bound by the aspirations of our younger, dumber, and much more boring selves. Well, to be fair, the future often is just a rehash of the past, Joris said as he rearranged their glasses around the table, looking for his lighter. I don't know. Joshua waved his hand at the covered Saudis on the boardwalk. This all seems pretty different from anything in my past. I've never dreamed of this. Sitting by the beach with a Dutchman, in Morocco, surrounded by Saudis. Life can be pretty unexpected, if one lets it. Yeah, okay, but honestly, most people don't dream of tomorrow, or of yesterday. They dream of what should be, or what might have been. Joris's passion rose a little. Their dreams are regrets and what-ifs. They dream of how they might have been a football star, or they dream of the life they could have had, the girlfriend who got away, the dad they never made peace with. That shit. They invent this other world in their head, one that can never happen, and they live there. That silenced Joshua. It occurred to him that those examples might have been more confessional than hypothetical. Probably not the football one, but possibly some of the other stuff. It seemed best to change the subject. Well, you know what I dream of? He asked. I mean literally, at night. What I dream of. Joris paused. What? An Indian. The Dutchman studied Joshua, sipped his coffee, then smirked. Feather or dot? Neither. She had dreamed of the ghost again. Pale, funny-looking, pedantic. He certainly wasn't like in the stories. They were supposed to have been proud builders and poets, warriors and musicians, confident and inspired. Her ghost was whiny, directionless, and completely unsure of himself. Not that she knew what she was doing with her life either, but she was just a Cree, not a dead man. The dream faded quickly, and when she'd blinked the sleep from her eyes, she could barely recall what it was about. She thought the ghost had been here in Morocco, but at the same time, it hadn't been Morocco. Morocco isn't full of Muslims. The Indian got up from her hostile bed and patted over the cold tiles to the sink. Her mouth tasted oddly of kiwi. Did I drink a vodka kiwi juice last night? She couldn't remember. She ran the water, stuck her head under the faucet, and rinsed her mouth out, taking care not to swallow. She didn't want to get sick. Key needed to pee badly, and probably more, but the room only had a sink. The toilet was down the hall and, awkward or not, that meant she had to find her money belt first. She couldn't exactly leave it in the room with him. Her life was in there. Sleeping with a man was one thing, but trusting him with your passport and cash was another. The Incan surfer snored softly as his muscled back rose and fell. His long hair, lightened by months in the sun, covered most of his face. The rest of him was completely naked, save for a tangle of sheets starting at his knees. Somewhere in those sheets were her shorts, and in those shorts was her money belt. Okay, this doesn't need to be weird, she thought. If he wakes up, I'll just say I'm trying to get dressed. Yes, another pair of shorts was clearly strewn across the chair, but he'd be too groggy to infer anything from that. Still, if he woke up, that'd mean having to talk to him. Slow and silent she approached, like an assassin. At the foot of the bed, she slipped a hand under the sheet. There was her bra, one of her socks, and... Damn, sure enough he stirred. I'd make a shit ninja. The surfer said something in Quechua, then switched to High Cree. What time is it? I'm just looking for my clothes, Key whispered. Go back to sleep. He rubbed his eyes, flipped over onto his back, and sat up with no concern for his nakedness. Who gets up that quickly? Back home, Key would hit the snooze button 2 or 3 times. Even when traveling, it took her a few minutes to shake the ghost out of her head before committing herself to consciousness. What are your plans today? He asked through his thick Incan accent. Last night, it had been sexy. Now she thought it made him sound a bit stupid. The last thing she wanted was to spend the day with this guy. What was his name? Kuno? She groped around for her shorts and an excuse. She actually wanted to do nothing except lie on the beach and get over her hangover. But if she said that, he'd just say, "Me too," and then she'd be stuck making small talk all day. Same deal if she said surfing, which was about the only other thing to do in town. Except it'd be even worse. She wasn't that good at surfing, so he'd naturally fall into the teacher role, and even thinking about that for another second was unbearable. She stalled, digging around aimlessly. Then it came to her. I have to catch a bus back to Tisnett, to this town called Tefraut. She remembered seeing the place in her guidebook. Tefraut? What's there? At last she found her shorts. Blue stones, she announced with a proud grin. The grin was for the shorts, not the stones. What? Kuno scratched the scalp beneath his mop of hair. Really? Well, they're painted. As she brought the shorts up to her waist, the money belt took its place against her belly, making her feel whole again. This Aztec artist went out to the hills north of town and painted these big boulders. They're kind of a pain to get to. After the bus, you have to rent a bicycle and ride out there. Huh. What's the draw? He looked about, probably for his underwear. I mean, they're just painted rocks, right? It's a spiritual pilgrimage, Key lied. Finding myself, finding God, you know, like going to Carthage or Mecca. I'll probably never get to Mecca, so I figure Tefraut instead. Who knows? Maybe I'll have a vision, and without all that fasting. Kuno was blinking at her. I gotta pee, she blurted out, somewhat spirited, then scampered out of the room. In the hall, the scamper became a run to the bathroom, where she finally found relief. She was quite pleased with the creativity of her own ruse. Hopefully he'd think she was some spiritual loon and hurry back to his beach. By tomorrow, she would be but a hazy memory for him. A bit of Kuno's story came to her as she urinated. He said he'd wasted 6 months here, surfing and smoking hash. He's not going anywhere, she assured herself. Still, Key had no idea why she'd made the fake trip sound so important. They really were just painted rocks, and she had absolutely no desire to waste a day going out to see them and another day coming back. As she sat on the toilet, she began to consider her real travel plans. Once she made it to Tisnett, she would likely catch a bus back to Aswara and then Marrakesh. She had a sudden desire to see sand dunes for some reason. Yes, endless sand dunes, roasting under a white sun. That would be beautiful. She'd read about tours where they take you out in the desert near the Moroccan-Barbarian border. You ride camels out into an ocean of sand until the sun sets. Out there you camp and get a chance to feel the cool desert breeze beneath a star-filled sky. And before it gets too cold, The guides build a campfire, and everyone sits around telling travel stories. Yes, she decided. That's what I'll actually do. But Kuno the surfer didn't need to know that. Last night at the bar, he'd been iffy on her until she told him about the quest. A beer, a man, and a mountain peak on every continent, she recited for the millionth time. Like clockwork, he'd asked, even Antarctica and the Ghostlands? And when she gave a confident nod, she was instantly irresistible. Not that men were too difficult to get into bed anyway, but the thought of being immortalized in someone's grand adventure made them putty in her hands. And like putty, boring within an hour. When she got back from the bathroom, Key felt re-energized. Her mind was still on the desert as she stepped through the door. Inside was Kuno, fully clothed, reading the guidebook she had left on the nightstand. You know, Tefraut sounds pretty interesting, he said, turning a page. Spiritual rocks. Why not? You only live once. Key fumbled for a new excuse. Came up empty. We better get going soon, said the surfer. The bus leaves in a couple hours. Somewhere on the road to Tefraut, the bus driver stopped to pray. Joshua decided to take the opportunity to go and empty his bladder. He rose, stretched his legs, and stepped down off the bus, leaving a napping Yoris behind. A hot, dusty breeze caressed him as he walked up the rocky hill. He checked a pea spot on his wrist, noting that it was a bit bigger today. Joshua sighed, unzipped his fly, and began to water a shrub. He quite liked urinating outside. It always reminded him of the hummingbird. It was at least a decade ago. Josh had been hiking near Red Lodge and took a break to relieve himself in a sunny clearing. Then, there it was, hovering near his penis as the stream of urine came forth. Its feathers were almost metallic green and shone in the sunlight. Joshua was entranced by the beauty. Time stood still. But then the stream sputtered out, and the bird vanished. It must have smelled something in my urine, he had surmised in retrospect, though it certainly could have been taken for a spirit animal by a hippie. Or an Indian, perhaps. They believe in spirit animals, don't they? Joshua wasn't certain. Movies were filled with so many lies. Unlike the forests around Red Lodge, the rocky hills of the Anti-Atlas were fairly barren of life. Joshua's gaze wandered from the shrub before him and found dirt, rocks, and some more shrubs. He peered down the road, back the way they'd come, and saw what looked like a shiny pool of water. A mirage, he knew. Light refraction, not reflection. He remembered something from grade school science. He saw something else along the highway, though, coming towards the bus. A man. That's odd. They were miles past 8 Baha. Where is he coming from? Then again, Josh had seen this sort of thing before, all over the world. From the window of a bus or a shared taxi, he would see people walking in what looked like the middle of nowhere. There had to be some village or road or farmhouse. Or maybe the guy just really liked walking. Joshua had finished his business and returned to the road by the time the man came upon him. Alhamdulillah? Asked the walking man with a grin. Praise be to God, Joshua remembered. It's usually the first Arabic word a foreigner learns. Josh supposed the man was referring to the joy of urination. Alhamdulillah, he answered. American? Quite. Josh had always heard stories about Americans lying and saying they were Canadian to get friendlier treatment, but he'd never tried it himself. It didn't seem necessary. As it was, people were pretty friendly to him wherever he went. As a foreigner, he was free entertainment, a chance to practice English, an opportunity to sell something. Every once in a while he had been treated poorly, but those times were few and far between. And usually it was some fellow Westerner angry about American foreign policy, the spread of American commercial culture, or some poorly thought out notion of imperialism. He'd never come across an Arab that had held being American against him. Not to his face, at least. Maybe, considering their own governments, they didn't feel they were in a position to judge. Or maybe they were just nice. In Josh's experience, Arabs were some of the kindest and most forgiving people anywhere. But the walking man didn't seem like an Arab. Certainly not a Moroccan. Yes, he was olive-skinned, with short curly hair dusted by sand, but something was off about the way he spoke. Joshua had read a bit about accents. He knew that people could quickly extract great quantities of information just from a little speech to determine who someone is. Their nation, their social standing, their education. Broadly, at least, on the level of stereotype. It was a leftover from prehistory, tribal times, a quick way to spot an outsider. Accent was a more powerful signal of otherness than even skin color. Black Americans suffered the worst discrimination, not for how they looked, but how they spoke. Or so he'd read, anyway. "You're not praying with the driver," the walking man observed, switching to perfect English. His accent wasn't American, or British, or Australian, or South African, or any other sort Joshua knew, so he looked for clues. The man wore dirty brown slacks and a short-sleeved plaid button-down. It wasn't atypical for Morocco, but neither was it particularly Moroccan. He could have been from anywhere. "I'm not a religious man," he replied. Joshua had learned not to mention his atheism to an Arab or a Berber. But this man wasn't a local, he'd decided. In the Middle East, a person was either a Christian or a Muslim. These were your choices. When Josh had first arrived here, he confessed himself an unbeliever to a couple of locals and been met with confusion and anger. Better pick a box people understand and stay in it. For the rest of his trip, he'd lied and called himself a Christian. He still had to endure some good-natured attempts to convert him to Islam, but he wasn't disturbing people anymore. The walking man tilted his head. "Don't you want to go to paradise?" Was that a joke, or is he serious? "That seems a bit scary," he said. "Don't you think?" "How so?" Joshua wasn't sure why he was suddenly talking religion with this mysterious man, but why not? Such was life. I live with hummingbirds and Indians. Why not debate the universe? "I was in an airport once, in Buenos Aires," Joshua began. All of his most interesting memories began with being somewhere far away, but back in America those stories made him sound like a braggart, so he'd learned to keep them to himself. Traveling was refreshing. He could be a storyteller again. "A family of Hasidic Jews happened to pass me in the terminal. The man strode well ahead of his wife, which I've heard is something they all do. His wife, meanwhile, walked hand in hand with their children. Except they weren't really children. They were full-grown men with bushy, pious beards. But they were children in a way. You see, the men were pinheads. I forgot the proper medical word for it. Micro something. It's a condition where your brain doesn't fully develop, leaving you both physically deformed and mentally retarded. These men's heads were too small and their ears and noses too big. Both of them were short, and they waddled beside their mother instead of walking. I assume their father had married his cousin and the family was inbred for generations before that. I don't know. Maybe I'm horribly stereotyping, but probably not. Anyway, as I walked by, one of the men yelled out, 'Daddy!' in the same high-pitched, panicked way a toddler might if his father had walked too far ahead of him. It was years ago, but I can still hear it. That cry, like it was yesterday. 'Daddy!' It was haunting, really. I felt ill, and so I sat down in some plastic airport seats and, just like that, I started crying, hard. I suppose it was for a bunch of reasons. Those two souls were the offspring of supposedly the most spiritually minded of God's chosen people, and I felt horrible for the pain and suffering that family was enduring. But what saddened me the most was, what happens next? When the pinheads died, would they be like that for an eternity in heaven? Or would God fix them, and then they'd know forever what he'd done to them in life? Some would say that God did not do that to them, the walking man offered. It was the parents' mistake. That might be even worse. Josh's voice grew high and impassioned. For those poor men to learn that the people they loved most in the world had done that to them with their inbreeding. For an eternity to live with the knowledge that their parents made them freaks. And that's the thing. An afterlife where we're still ourselves means an afterlife where we have our memories forever. God, I read about a girl who was imprisoned and raped by her father in a basement for years. Does she have to remember that until the end of time? Joshua paused. No, the only thing scarier than death is eternal life. That made the walking man smile. Some say turtles have eternal life, he answered coolly. Lobsters, hydras, clams. Their lives don't seem so bad, and their parents made them even stupider than these pinheads you speak of. Josh hadn't expected that. He wasn't really sure what point the man was making. It was just perplexing. Still, hummingbirds and Indians. Turtles die, Joshua said. I thought they just didn't age. That's right. The walking man looked over to the bus driver, who had long since finished praying and was now finishing a cigarette. It was time to go. But it must be nice not to have time's hot breath on the back of your neck. Turtles feel no need to pray, or weep in airports about the universe. Maybe, if we are very, very lucky, we will return to this earth as turtles. They simply swim and enjoy their lives. The driver was boarding the bus, so Joshua headed towards the door. And then get eaten by sharks, he called back playfully. And then get eaten by sharks, the walking man agreed. Though not so playfully. You know what the problem is with you Kree? Asked Kuno. You think you own the world. Kee rolled her eyes as she untangled the bicycle chain. She'd had this conversation about 1,000,000 times already. We're not the ones who colonized half the world, she shot back. Your country did that. Just talking like this made her feel like a darkneck. She loathed everything about those fucking conservatives back home, waving their flags with their oversized, proud-to-be Kree t-shirts, straining against beer bellies. She promised herself she wouldn't tell the Incan that the Kree had saved their asses in the wars. They'd all be speaking Chiruan without us, one of those knuckle-draggers would say. Not her. Not that there wasn't some truth in it, but it was a massive oversimplification. And besides, it was stupid to take credit for what another generation had actually done. Damn this chain. The man who'd rented them the bicycles back in Tefraut had thrown in a repair kit. Now she got why. The bicycles were total shit, and her chain had come off 3 times already. At least it's a quick fix. Kuno's flat tire had been much more time-consuming. She'd had no idea that bicycle tires even had inner tubes. When Kuno had pulled the tire apart, the sight had taken her back to her grandfather's home on Lake Michigan. The family would go every summer when she was a kid. She and her sister would pull giant black inner tubes from the old shed and race down the wooden steps to the lake. On calm days, they would lounge in them lazily until they turned blisteringly hot from the sun. Then they would flip them over to the cool wet side and see how long they took to become unbearable again. On rough days it was different. Then they would share a single tube and brave the crashing waves, like 2 sailors in a dinghy, trapped in a raging storm. Until now, she had never really thought about the fact that those inner tubes were the insides of large truck tires. Cars don't have them, but trucks do, and apparently so do bicycles. It made her feel stupid. Her whole life she had been using the term inner tube, and she'd never thought about its meaning. Little kids would ride colorful ones behind speedboats and down snowy hills, and those were certainly never meant for truck tires. She had called those inner tubes as well. Did other people call them that? Or did they just say tubes? She couldn't remember. The Incas have made their mistakes, the surfer conceded. He lounged on a rock behind her in the sun, working on his already dark tan. But that was in the past. Now we were focused on aid, not dominance. Bison shit. The Incas would give aid to their former colonies, sure, to create new markets for their exports. Not to mention the aid often consisted of paying a foreigner hundreds of thousands of wampums so he could teach a local market about microcredit loans worth a few hundred wampums. Ridiculous. Look, Kree dominance is just a factor of the market, she answered, impatiently lining her chain up along the crankset. If people want to buy buffalo burgers and fry bread, who are we to tell them no? Back home, we like foreign products. Other countries just want that too. So you see no problem with your fast food chains and hypermarkets driving all the locals out of business, destroying their local culture. That was rich coming from an Incan. Machu Mart was one of the biggest companies in the world. When we won't sell to a country, people scream at us about the cruelty of sanctions. When we will, it's imperialism or some other nebulous term. Like cultural genocide, you mean? Well, isn't that what it is? All the diversity of the world is being swallowed up by this huge, Kree-centric commercial monolith? Kee groaned. It's not like killing endangered species or reducing biodiversity. Old culture dies and new culture is born all the time. You talk like foreign cultures are these static things that have been around for thousands of years, like an ancient tree we're suddenly cutting down. Everything's changing anyway. People kill their old practices and make up new ones constantly, regardless of big bad globalization. Kuno stewed on that. I don't know. There's change, and then there's change. I still think a Cree cultural monopoly sounds horrific. I think you have way too much Indian guilt. Key spun the gears of her bike. They turned well enough. Shouldn't we feel guilty? He was good and angry now. For slavery and colonialism? For killing a continent of people? He meant the ghosts, of course. Key felt a shiver. Different issues, she said. She picked up the bike and flipped it over. The Cree lands should feel horrible for slavery, but that's to do with the black people we have at home, not the ones here in Africa. And, big picture, we barely participated in colonialism. Like I said, you South Continent people did most of that. As for Columbus, I'm not going to be bothered over some sickly idiot from 600 years ago. That was the weakest of Kuno's arguments, really. The Indians had never meant to kill off the ghosts. Christopher Columbus had taken those Indians back to Europe of his own volition. Some say they were prisoners. Columbus showed them off to his homeland as proof of his discovery. Exotic foreigners to trade with. But then people started dying. It had started with a few dozen, then hundreds, thousands. Queen Isabella, the last queen, thought it was some kind of curse, so she sent her guests back with an apology, and a fleet of ships full of propitiatory gifts. Books, swords, gunpowder, horses. She had no way of knowing she'd just seeded a dozen new empires. Today, historians know more or less what happened. It was a virus, almost certainly. The ghost people must have had weak immune systems that were unprepared for Indian germs. But that answer came centuries later. At the time, it must have seemed like punishment from God. As the virus spread across the ghost lands, everything fell apart. The ghost people were unwelcome in Africa and Asia, slaughtered when they arrived as refugees. Their pale skin marked them, letting anyone know where they came from and what death they carried with them. And then there were the famous stories of Suleiman the Magnificent, holding the Bosphorus to save the Ottoman Empire, and perhaps the world, from doom. Oh, a few ghost people made it out safely. Thousands, actually. But over time, they'd bred with the locals, and it was near impossible anymore to find someone as pale as the ghosts in her dreams. As for the ghost lands, superstition had kept people away for centuries. Now its visitors were mainly campers and corporations looking for resources to extract. Trade had boomed for the Indians, followed by technological progress and unification. The term Indian, Columbus's howler of a misnomer, was adopted to put fear in the hearts of their enemies. Remember Columbus. Remember how dealing with us ended for him. Soon enough, just about everyone on the twin continents called themselves Indians. And then they looked outward, conquering and sometimes enslaving wherever they landed on their new ships. The Tyrona must have savored the irony when they conquered South Asia. Indians conquering other India. Well, it bothers me, Kuno said. Entire civilization's dead because of us. You know, it's karma. Somehow, somewhere, we'll have to pay for it. Karma? Key grinned as she mounted her bike. I would have never taken you for a Hindu Indian. Aren't you supposed to call them Native Americans? People have their personal preferences, Joshua told the Dutchman. Some people like to be called by their tribe's name, and other people prefer indigenous. But I read that the latest survey had the term American Indian beating out Native American, so that's what I default to. I'll call people whatever they want to be called. Yours pulled down the kickstand with his foot and let his bike find its balance. Can you call me Your Highness, then? Josh laughed. Of course. So, this is it. The blue stones from your vision? A bit anticlimactic. The two men stared at the boulders. Blue paint covered a few dozen of them. Some were faded. Others looked like they'd been done more recently. The largest stone, which very well may have been part of the bedrock for all he could tell, went up a good 40 feet. The artwork was certainly unique, and it had clearly taken a good deal of time to create. They were in the middle of nowhere, so the artist must have hauled gallon upon gallon of blue paint out here, along with ladders. Josh could at least appreciate the effort. But sadly, damningly, the piece wasn't beautiful. The natural beauty of their surroundings dwarfed the art in every respect. The earthly colors, the majestic rock shapes, even the spattering of shrubs around them made the painted rocks look absolutely junky by comparison. The Mona Lisa might look plain out here, frankly. So what had been the point? Josh sighed. I agree that these rocks are rather disappointing. The artist seems to have made everything worse. Humans usually do, said Joris, but I'll grant him this. We wouldn't have ridden out here and gotten to see scenery like this without your mission to see these stupid rocks. So thank you, artist. What's his name? I don't know. Something Belgian. Thank you, Belgian artist. And thank you, Indian girl. What's her name? I don't know that either, Josh admitted. I told you, she doesn't speak English, and I usually forget most of the dreams anyway. Right. Joshua hadn't asked the Dutchman to come along, but he was still a little embarrassed to have brought him here for this. For some reason, he'd told Joris back in Agadir about the Indian girl and the blue stones. It was all he could remember of the previous night's dream, and when he saw the passage in his guidebook about the artwork outside Tefraut, he figured it was some sort of sign. Someone telling him something important. Now they were here, and it was just some rocks painted blue. Joshua cast his gaze about the landscape, scratching some pee on his scalp. There was certainly no Indian girl here to tell him about the deeper meaning of life. There was no clue he could see, no riddle to decipher, no quest to save the universe. Do you feel anything? Josh asked his companion. Like what? Like an epiphany. Should I be feeling one? Maybe. Does this place make you want to go home, marry your girlfriend, and have beautiful 10-foot Dutch babies with wooden shoes? Joris let out a laugh. I don't think these rocks are blue enough to do that. And anyway, I never said anything about marriage. Marriage is pointless. Oh, I don't know. Joshua rested a hand on one of the blue boulders, hoping it would make a difference. It was warm from the sun, but that was it. What, you believe in holy matrimony and all? I didn't take you for a religious man. No, nothing like that. But marriage does have a function. It's an exercise in self-control. Like putting an alarm clock on the other side of the room or throwing away a pack of cigarettes so you won't smoke them later. Josh hoisted himself up on the warm boulder and took a seat. Don't remind me about cigarettes. Joris had lost his lighter in Agadir, and he'd taken it as a sign of his own to quit the habit. He'd only had 5 cents, hitting up locals for a light as they went along. But okay, self-control. Tell me all about it. Well, marriage is present you trying to influence the actions of future you. Present you wants to stay together with someone, but he knows future you might be a dumbass and fuck it up. So present you sabotages future you. Marriage entangles you legally, financially, and socially so that it's really difficult and embarrassing to break up. You're motivated to make it work just to avoid all that inconvenience. You make it sound so romantic. I'm just saying marriage has its uses. Well, not for me. If I want to be with someone, I'll be with someone. I don't need extra motivation. And why would I want to hinder future me in any way? Future me is smarter and wiser than present me, isn't he? Plus, the guy's been off cigarettes for longer. Shouldn't I trust him? Joshua chuckled. It was a good point. The two men paused and enjoyed the calm for a minute, listening to the wind. Then Joris turned to him. So, Joshua, I was thinking of an explanation for all of this. Perhaps you read the guidebook section on these blue stones, but you forgot you had. But it was all still in your subconscious, and then you dreamed of it. And later, when you reread it, you assumed the book was matching your dreams. Joshua nodded again. The Dutchman was almost certainly correct. Iago and Othello, he mumbled. Do you remember anything else? I mean, besides the Indian girl and the blue stones? Joshua closed his eyes and thought. The breeze rustled past his ears. For a moment he thought of crashing waves on the ocean shore. I don't know, Joshua shrugged. Maybe surfing? So, who painted this? Kuno asked. Some Aztec dude. Key pulled the guidebook from her backpack and looked it up. Tezcatlipoca Barca. The boulders were a mix of blue hues, some as pale as the sky, faded by the sun over time. Others, deeper and darker, thanks to a newer coat of paint. So he hadn't done it all at once. This guy had hiked all the way back out here, inspected the little blotch he'd made on nature's canvas, then actually decided to keep going. Several times. I guess I like it. Kuno walked over to a boulder and put his hands against it. Well, it's not exactly Mecca after all, Key admitted. Now that place must be intensely spiritual. The Incan leapt atop the rock, showing off his athletic legs. You know, I have this weird desire to go there. To Mecca? You know you have to be Muslim, right? Yeah, I know. But I'll never forget the first time I saw that black cube thing. It was back in university. I just stumbled home from some party, insanely wasted. Probably high too. I don't know, but I was practically falling over, really out of it. So I stumbled into my apartment, and for some reason I went to the front room, where the TV was. No idea why I did that. It must have been 2 or 3 in the morning. I should have headed straight to bed. But I turned the TV on, and there it was. It must have been the news, some kind of reporting on Hajj. They showed thousands of people dressed in white circling around it. At the time, I had no idea what I was even looking at, but I must have watched for a good 30 minutes. People circling, my world spinning. Fell asleep right there on the floor. So the circling of the Kaaba on TV was the lava lamp of your stoned drunken stupor. Kuno laughed it off. The universe works in mysterious ways. Look, I get that Muslims don't drink and I'm an infidel and all of that. That's what the religion says. That's what people say. But what does the universe say? What does fate say? What does God say? Mecca was a holy place long before Islam showed up. There's something there that calls people to it. There's gotta be. And that same mystic force shot itself up into the TV camera and then beamed itself into your apartment? Let's say I'm God. I'm aligning neutrinos, doing God stuff. Why do I bother with calling out to this cross-faded Incan? So he'll make a pilgrimage someday to a desert full of malls? Kuno smiled. Maybe God doesn't care. But I felt something. He punctuated his words by leaping back to the ground in front of her. Aren't you the one who wanted to come out here? Well, not really. Hey, I've been to Carthage and stood in St. Peter's Square like every good Catholic girl should. You know what I felt there? Nothing. People around me all weeping. I really think it was all in their heads. They felt what they wanted to feel. So I wanted to be called to Mecca. Not specifically, but... Look, you had gotten drunk and high that night. Really drunk and really high, you said. Was that because things were going great, do you think? Or were you maybe feeling bad about yourself? Lonely? Depressed? Lost in the universe? So maybe you tried to shake that feeling with booze and weed, and you probably tried to shake it with sex too, but you got home alone, you didn't get lucky that night. Then on TV, you saw people doing this mysterious spiritual thing, but all together, connected by it. Some kind of connection, some kind of meaning. Isn't that what you wanted right then? Kuno picked up a rock about the size of his fist and tossed it as far off into the distance as he could. It landed with a high click. You're a real buzzkill, he said. Don't I know it? She'd always had been. Overthinking, overanalyzing, playing devil's advocate. It didn't really win her any friends, but she honestly didn't know how to stop. She'd work herself up into some argument with someone for no real reason. A piece of her would look on in horror, screaming, "Stop!" But she couldn't. She was on automatic. Later, she'd berate herself for being pointlessly difficult. This was going to be one of those times. Who cares if Kuno tries to use Hinduism or Islam or surfing to make himself happier? We're all lonely. We're all afraid of death. We're all anxious that we might be wasting what little time we have here. Can I blame him for just not wanting to be miserable for 1 second? For a while, the two said nothing. It's beautiful out here, Key finally offered, to break the silence. Just as she said it, a gust of wind blew sand in her eye. She turned away from the wind and waited for the tears. "Only come in and have a look," the carpet salesman urged. This was the 5th time he accosted Joshua, trying to get him into his shop. The first time, he and Joris had just gotten off the bus into Frout. He'd tried again when they went out for dinner, and again when they'd gone to rent the bicycles the next morning, and again when they'd returned. And here he was again this morning. Joshua wasn't going to reward his persistence. Getting tricked into looking at carpets happened to every foreigner once, but rarely twice. One enters politely, just wanting to browse, but then suddenly a cushioned seat appears, along with heavily sweetened tea. Now one is trapped by hospitality. To reject the offer of tea is rude in any culture, so the foreigner sits. How long can it take to drink a cup of tea? A while, actually, as one must first wait for it to cool. And while the tea is still scalding in its glass, the shop owner unpacks every carpet he owns, with speed and fury enough to shake that cushioned seat. Dozens upon dozens of carpets are dumped before the foreigner as they test their tongue on the steaming liquid, feeling guiltier with each exertion made on their behalf. Guilt is, of course, the goal. After the tea and all this trouble the shopkeep has taken to unpack his whole collection, the foreigner is left feeling like they owe him something. The salesman asks which carpet they like, but there are no prices on display. After being shown so many carpets, it would be barbarous to declare that one hadn't liked any of them, so the polite foreigner points to one with a pretty design. Immediately, to like is understood as to want, and so the bargaining begins, something the foreigner, if they're a Westerner, has little to no experience in. More often than not, a carpet isn't actually sold. Carpets can be expensive, and often the salesman has overestimated the foreigner's wealth. But the foreigner rarely escapes without an unpleasant argument. Best case scenario, the tourist wastes an hour of their vacation feeling awkward in exchange for some cheap sugary tea. Worst case, they haul an overpriced carpet around with them for the rest of their trip. Joshua decided to be direct. "My friend, there is no way I am ever coming into your shop to buy a carpet. I am sorry." "I'd give you a good price." "Perhaps you would. I'm still never coming in. Carpets are not my cup of tea." Joshua smirked at his private joke. The salesman looked hurt. Joshua almost felt bad. Almost. "I do not understand why you foreigners never buy carpets from me. Don't you understand that Morocco is a poor country? If you don't buy things, it will never get better." There was some logic to that, but Josh preferred the logic of capitalism. He wasn't obligated to buy a product he didn't want. Even if he pitied the man and bought a carpet out of charity, that would just encourage him to harass more tourists and produce even more useless carpets. Really, the answer was for this man to do something else. I'll tell you a big secret about the West. We hate, absolutely hate, not having a price written next to the product. The salesman waved a hand dismissively. "Why? I give good prices." "Perhaps you do," smiled Joshua, scratching a pea patch on his elbow. "But Westerners don't know that. They don't want to be cheated, and they hate feeling stupid." "But I would not cheat them," the salesman protested. "They are afraid you will. Look, we have carpets at home. What you're selling is not a carpet. You're selling a memory of Morocco. No one wants to buy something if every time they look at it they'll be reminded of how they were harassed, cheated, and made to feel like a rube." The salesman scowled, indignant. Joshua went right on. "You know what I'd do? I would put the prices right on the carpet. I'd be the only shop in town with price tags, so all the tourists would come to me, and I would write a little explanation, too, for each carpet. Who made it? Is it Arab or Berber? How long did it take? What style is it in? Write a story, and then when people buy the carpet, they'll feel connected to it, and to Morocco. This carpet was made by Fatima from Fez in the style of her city, and took her 100 hours. That sort of thing." The salesman was already shaking his head. "That wouldn't work. If I set a price on a carpet for all to see, the shop next door will boast that they have the same one for 10 dirham less. They could always go a little lower." He wasn't wrong. That was the nature of competition. Joshua would have continued the argument, pointless as he knew it was, but then he spotted something out of the corner of his eye. Something plaid. He looked behind him. Nothing. My imagination? He thanked the shop owner for his kind attentions and headed towards the market. He had actually been out to get food for the bus trip north to Taroudant before he'd been sidetracked by the carpet salesman. Besides, Joshua figured that if he'd seen what he thought he'd seen, that's where he had the best chance of seeing it again. Wednesday was market day, and the square, normally a barren dirt field, now bustled with commerce. Most Moroccan markets were hectic and overwhelming affairs, but Tafraout was a smaller, simpler place. There were no smoky, narrow alleys like in Marrakesh or Fez, crammed with shoppers, tourists, and pickpockets. Instead, the market was simply 100 merchants on 100 blankets, colorful items stacked invitingly beside them. Ramshackle canopies had been erected overhead to shield merchants and customers alike from the scorching sun. Joshua looked around and, sure enough, there he was, examining a plate piled high with some red powdery spice. He wore the same outfit he'd had on days ago, brown slacks covered with dirt and a plaid button-down. It was the walking man. Josh came up beside him. You made it to your destination. That was a long walk. The walking man met his eyes and smiled. I have walked longer. Joshua returned the smile. I never asked. You have an interesting accent. Where are you from? Morocco? Morocco? He shook his head. No, no, no. I am a person of the sea. He is screwing with me again. Like the turtle? He asked ironically. The walking man was straight-faced. No, like a person of the sea. The world feared us once, but now, not so much. Not so much at all. You're a merman, then? I'm not riddling you. I told you what I am. There was nothing light about his tone. And I've lived long enough to know what you are. You are a dreamer. That struck him. He was suddenly uneasy. What did he mean by that? For once, Joshua didn't know what to say. You should listen to your dreams, the walking man said. He then patted Joshua on the shoulder and walked away. Joshua made it back to the hostel, slightly dizzy. He had forgotten to buy any food, but that didn't seem important. When he got to their room, Joris was there, packing his backpack beneath an old faded poster of a Japanese wave over Mount Fuji. The Dutchman looked up from his clothes to Joshua's pale face. Is something wrong? Some weird man in the streets told me to listen to my dreams. Joris chewed on that for a moment. I once had a homeless man yell at me that he'd seen me masturbating. Thing is, I really had jerked off just before leaving my flat, like 30 minutes before. It really freaked me out. Josh should have laughed, but he didn't. Look, said Joris, inspirational types tell you to follow your dreams all the time, and you already went to the Blue Stones. There was nothing there. I dreamed again last night. Oh? Of what? I don't know, Joshua said. I've forgotten mostly. But I think I need to sneak into Mecca.